So, good morning from New York. It's a rather excellent day to start being here. So, let's go find some places.
Okay, so this is Easter Sunday, bright sunshine, probably about 9 o'clock in New York City, and I'm on location, the corner of Ludlow and Rivington, which is where the reporter Tom lives. And so I'm down here to find out more about his neighbourhood and why he's chosen to work here. So tell me about Tom and this location.
So, Tom's an expat British journalist. He moved over here when he was quite young, newly married with a kid. Since that time, his life has kind of lost a little bit of its direction. So, he's no longer with his wife. He questions his role as a father. This is kind of the place where he's moved to after his relationship has broken down. So he's a long way away from his family back in the UK. He's a long way away from his son, who he misses. And this is basically where he's kind of trying to find himself at the start of the story.
Tell us about this area and why Tom's chosen to live here.
Well, first of all, it's really weird actually being here. I've spent so much time looking at all this surrounding area in Google Street View and trying to research where Tom was going to live. So to actually kind of physically be here is very strange. It's like walking onto the set of the movie that I've been working on for a while. So Tom actually lives over here. Cross over. This is Ludlow Street, and Tom lives just in one of these tenement buildings here. And there's the creperie across the way where he kind of looks down on from his window. And this is the area where he actually comes back to at the very start of the book. So it seemed a good place to actually start our little journey. Also, if I just walk you around this way, I don't know if you can see over here, but behind me is a little grocery store where he actually goes in chapter 1. So again, it's just really strange to be here in a real place that I've been writing about for so long. So let's see where else we can find. And here we are at police headquarters, which is where Tom goes to meet his mate Leo. And as a kind of unexpected thing, we've just walked past the sandwich shop where Tom speaks to Leo. You're on Broadway. So good morning. Another day, another location. We're here outside Port Authority bus terminal, which is where Tom goes off on his first steps to actually meet the killer. He's so distracted by the thought of actually meeting up with a real life serial killer, but because I wrote it, it's impossible for me not to talk about a baked goods shop. So I've got those smells in the book because they're so important, as all good bakery should be. So here we are, moving on to find more locations. See you later. So this is the beginning of our actual driving part of the road trip. And we are stuck in traffic on the Jersey Turnpike, which is nice.
And what number Jersey Turnpike? There is only one. There is 95.
Is it? Okay. Well, I'm working on the basis that from Tom's perspective, he has other things to think about at this time in his journey. He's too worried about the fact that he's been picked up by a serial killer. So he's not thinking it through clearly. But yeah, it's exciting. We made it out of New York, and yeah, heading down to Seaford, Delaware now.
I still think it's a bit hypocritical about Tom being worried about, oh, he was picked up. He agreed to the journey to going with Jay, the serial killer. But that was on his terms. If you agree to something, you've agreed, period.
He didn't think he was going to go. He made the bargain thinking...
Yeah, well then he shouldn't have made a bargain that he wasn't willing to keep. So I have no sympathy for him, actually.
So you're kind of down on him?
At the
You're a
moment.
team serial killer, yeah?
No, I'm not team serial killer either.
You're allowed to be. You're allowed to be team serial killer. That's totally cool.
No, I just don't like the idea of someone makes an agreement, but unless it's on their terms, that then they get all antsy and etc. He's a very self-centered shite.
Is he?
You know?
You don't really like him that much.
Well, I'm waiting for him to maybe have a change of heart, or to actually not be expecting everything to drop in his lap. You know? Anything of value requires hard work and moving outside of your comfort zone. You know, hard work does not hurt anyone.
So this is your kind of your moral position.
No, it's just my opinion. Some people maybe, you know, things do come easy, but then do you value those things as much, or do you only perceive their value once you've lost it?
No, I don't think you appreciate things that you get easily as much as you appreciate things that you strive towards. If you work hard to do something, you know, you practice, you save up, whatever it is, then you appreciate it more. I think that's fair. But I think in this situation, Tom he's more caught off balance by the proposition. He's contacted out of the blue. He doesn't know what's gonna happen. He thinks that the police will be able to do what they need to do before he's at risk himself. Sorry, I'm trying to say all this without too many spoilers. But at the point when he realizes that he's caught up in stuff, I mean, at this point in the journey, he doesn't know totally what lies ahead. So he's just scared at the moment because I'm in the presence of somebody who could be a murderer. He doesn't know everything yet.
But if he was going to be murdered, the guy wouldn't keep him along as baggage.
No. Well, I think
So
he's figured out.
He must have that amount of common sense.
Yeah, I think he's figured out that he's unlikely to be bumped off straight away, but that's, I guess, akin to sitting in a cage with a very full tiger. The tiger might not eat you now, but it might eat you later.
Yeah.
I assume tigers eat people, don't they? Yeah, they do.
I think if they're hungry, they may do. Might wipe your face off.
Now I'm thinking about man-eaters. And not in the kind of... That's cougars, isn't it? That's something totally different. We're not going to Annapolis yet.
No.
Genuine cat. Hey, look, dinosaur. So here.
Where she says, point to. Turn right.
This is going to be our first murder. How romantic.
In 300 yards, turn left.
That's the end of our first major driving bit. So we've just driven down here from New York and we are now in Seaford Industrial Park, which is kind of midway down Delaware. This is quite a pivotal location for Tom. This is his first full day on the road with Jay. He's understandably scared because he's on the road with a serial killer. But at the moment, he kind of isn't sure what Jay wants and what Jay's really like. He believes that Jay is a murderer, but until he comes here, he has no absolute definitive proof of that. So at this stage, he's quite nervous, but there's more to come that will make him a lot more concerned. This location here is where I chose to as a basis for Dintech Technologies, which is a fictional company, and they're based just over there. And that's where Jay is coming to meet somebody. And there's a small car park outside the front of it. And he's waiting for somebody. So they park up in a kind of a vacant lot. They wait for a while. And then, things kick up a notch and things get a little bit more real for Tom. So it's quite strange being here. I wonder how the people nearby would feel if they knew what was happening in the story. And it's while they're here, traveling around this area, that I guess it's a bit of a reality check for Tom. Up until this point, he's made a name for himself, reporting on crime, doing true crime pieces, some investigative journalism, but it's always been at arm's length. And I think this is one of the first times that he realizes the reality of what he's been writing about. which is obviously quite a lot to take in. I think Jay understands that, but he's also a considerate serial killer. So when he does get out of the car to go and do what he does, he rather kindly offers to leave the radio on. Anyway, we're now going to carry on. Next stop, Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Cinnamon toast and coffee and more coffee. Doesn't get better than that.
A breakfast made for champions.
It is the breakfast of champions.
Yeah, especially after all that cheesecake last night.
Yes, baby, all.
I regret nothing.
You admit to nothing.
I admit to everything, but I regret nothing. So it's a beautiful morning here in Annapolis. We stayed in a slightly nicer hotel than Tom did. And we went to the Cheesecake Factory last night, so that was good. So yeah, we're gonna hit the road now and head off to West Virginia.
How did you come up with this sort of route?
I had types of places in mind. So I wanted to start off in a big city because that felt right, and New York would be a sensible place for a true crime reporter to be based. And then I thought different sorts of places. So I'll go for a small town thing here, I'll go for a larger town thing there, and that largely defined my kind of search. I knew where I wanted to end up as well. So that kind of draws a line across the states, and then it's a question of which particular direction do they go, and does anything interfere with their journey. But I kind of like that idea of a lot of contrast there. And then it was hours and hours and hours on
In 10
Google.
miles, take exit 191 to merge onto I-64 West towards Lexington.
See?
There you are. So where are we now on this part of the route?
So we're currently heading down from Virginia towards West Virginia. And I don't know the road we're on. Hold on. We're on... Can't read it. Ask me again in a second when you've told me what that says.
It says West Lexington 64.
What road are we on then?
Yeah, it says 64.
Is it interstate or highway or what?
Who knows?
Hang on. There's a
It
sign.
says I-64 West.
Alright.
So that must be the interstate. Okay.
So
So
we're-
for a Brit, I'm imagining it. I'm going to ask you, because you know Tom, how would he felt with this sort of travelling? Because for myself, my geography of America is very poor, and my sense of scale of just how vast the USA is, I can't even comprehend it, because this is the second day outside of New York, and it just seems like relentless driving.
I think that's fair. Tom's based in New York. His ex-wife and his son are in Boston, and he thinks that's terribly far away. It's hundreds of miles round trip. But actually, if you look at Boston and New York on a map, they're really close together. So this is for somebody who thinks still maybe in British terms about journey lengths. This is just going so far outside of his comfort zone, if you like, physically and mentally. So he's going on a long journey, and it's the kind of journey that he would normally fly to go from one place to another if it was this kind of distance. So the idea of actually being on the road for all this time is totally alien to him.
I was wondering about Jay. I know that he works in the financial services sector. Was he ever on the road?
Yeah, so he did work in the insurance business, and that did mean that he was spending a lot of time on the road. He's been a commercial traveller. He's sort of done the miles, stayed in the motels. This is kind of quite a natural location for him. He can switch off, just tune it out. For him, the long distances, the loneliness, all that side of things is completely normal. But for Tom, it's obviously very strange. So you have that kind of nice contrast of somebody who's totally thrown by their situation and their environment and their company, and somebody else who's completely comfortable with it. But it's always more interesting to see what people are like when they're outside of their comfort zones.
When they're swapping cars, that he leaves like a trailer video or something behind.
Trail cam, yeah.
Trail cam. Can you explain what that is for those like me who had never heard of that before?
Trail cams are like little wireless cameras that are motion activated, and people use them for hunting or for wildlife photography. So if you want to know where the big predator is, you put trail cams around, and when the camera goes off, then it will take a picture and you'll see, so you'll basically be able to identify what has moved through this area.
So tell me, does Jay use that not just for obviously keeping an eye on his storage spaces, but also for his own use?
He wants to know if anybody is onto him, so he consistently puts trail cams behind him effectively, so when he changes vehicles, he'll leave a trail cam inside the self-storage lockup where he's keeping his vehicle, and that way, because these are like wireless devices, they just use a kind of a cellular service to upload photos. If you get a motion alert or a photo from it, it's just like using one of those home security kind of cameras that you can get at home, that sort of thing, except with a really long battery life, suitable for being outside. He can then find out if there's anybody kind of snooping around behind him. So he does that as a way of just watching his back.
Did he use those when he wanted to maybe stalk any of his potential victims?
That's a really good question. But Jay doesn't tend to stalk his victims physically.
I mean, in terms of ascertaining their daily routine, would he have maybe, so that he's not seen in an area looking very conspicuous, would he have just left a camera there to see when someone's coming and going?
He tends to stalk his victims using other methods. Jay has a very investigative mindset. As somebody who used to actually be an insurance investigator, he's very much about gathering information, looking for patterns, looking for behaviour and anomalies in behaviour, and understanding the habits that people have and the way that they're likely to act in a certain situation. And he can do so much of that without ever actually being physically close to the person. So frequently, the first time people meet Jay is the last time they meet him.
Okay, so with our guy, the first murder that Tom witnessed, he knew where the guy worked and had an idea of the car he drove. What about the timing of that? How did he know what time to be there?
The guy works in a like a technology company. They'll have about like normal kind of office hours and stuff. So that's not too difficult.
No.
Are you trying to catch me out?
No, I'm just fascinated because crime isn't something that I research personally myself for. I was going to say to commit crime or to write about crime.
Not yet.
Yeah. So it's like, well, how do you think these up? And getting into, because we've spoken a lot about Tom and how he feels about, I was going to say shit, but now I've said it, on the road. But it's how also Jay's mind works. I understand that he must be so organised, and I think that comes maybe, this is maybe a bit of a stretch, but if he's had to be on the road for so much of his life, I imagine that you have to be fairly well organised. You know, you've got enough petrol in your car, especially with these distances that people have to travel, and you've got the right documentation, etc., the right information. So
He's well prepared.
Yeah.
He is well prepared. He's had years to think about this.
But even before that, he's had the training in a sense. I think that's what I'm
Yeah.
starting to imagine. So,
His family background is very conducive to that kind of working things out, solving puzzles and problems. That combined with his previous work all helps him to effectively see how other people mess up, see how other people make mistakes, see how other people are caught. So he's kind of able to approach problems from the other side and understand the sort of things he has to guard against and the kind of mistakes he mustn't make.
so how does that come into your writing process or your planning process when looking at committing a crime? Do you backtrack and see, well, what would I do in that situation to ensure I don't get caught so that I can complete my task?
Honestly, I try to figure out how many things you're going to find wrong with it, and then I try and find a way of solving them, because you are probably the person who's best at seeing through pretty much any mistakes that are there. You'll find them.
Thank you for the flattery.
Hey, I'm not the one who used to ruin every single whodunit by watching like a Sherlock Holmes or a Poirot or an Inspector Morse or anything. You have that knack of understanding when somebody makes a mistake. It's like it's in a different colour to you, and that natural innate ability you've done it on all my books. You've kind of spotted things that nobody else has spotted, and given me the opportunity to go back and kind of fix that mistake. So I'm hugely grateful. It's true.
Okay. Yeah.
Are we in West Virginia yet?
I don't know. I haven't seen any more signs for the sulphur springs, and I'm really sort of wondering about this white sulphur business.
Okay, we'll be back when it's West Virginia.
Okay, I have a question for you. That's not going to give any spoilers away for anyone on Up Close and Fatal. Road trip, very long.
Oh, hold on. You know where we are now?
I'm going to show us entering West Virginia. Beyond Dillery.
We should sing Country
Yay.
Road now.
No, because I don't know the lyrics.
How can you not know the lyrics to Country Road?
Because I don't.
It's Country
Anyway.
Road, Take Me Home. That one.
No,
No.
not singing.
Still baffled.
Yeah.
Alright, what was the
Maybe
question?
tomorrow. Anyway, in the book, there is dialogue, obviously, between Tom and Jay.
Yeah.
He is there in the car. How do you get over when you're actually writing and you've got two people and they are travelling vast amounts of distance? Being able to almost teleport locations but make it feel like they've been in the car for ages, but without having just drivel being written down.
Lots of short chapters. I think I've always preferred the lots of short chapters approach to writing, because I think of it as fast forwarding through to the next good bit. We do it all the time. If we watch an action film, we don't see the whole helicopter ride. We just see the bit where the hero jumps out of the helicopter at the end. If we have a massive car chase, we don't see the whole car chase. We might see the beginning, a couple of exciting corners, and a bit at the end. This is exactly the same. It's those moments where something happens, something changes, we learn something about the character learns something about themselves. It's those moments of transition that are important, and I just want to get to the next one. So I write more than is in the final book, but frequently I look for ways to combine two conversations into one, so that it tightens things up and just keeps it moving along. It's going to take us 10 days with a flight to do less of the journey than is in the book.
How long was the journey in the boat?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's like a couple of weeks. So we're doing all of that. Of course, we want to fast forward through it because it's all got to fit into 100,000 words. And 100,000 words of service stations and going to the bathroom and drinking more coffee and filling up with fuel, all of that. Who cares? Moments where we get to see people in conflict. Moments where we get to see people empathizing with someone they shouldn't. Moments where we begin to understand what makes certain people behave the way they do. Those are the interesting bits, to me anyway. So that's the bits I focus on.
Okay. Going back to something you said earlier in this conversation, when you said about in order to tighten things up, you look for ways to bring two conversations into one. Explain what you mean by that, or give us an example, not necessarily from the book if you don't want to, because this is going to be for a non-spoiler part of the film.
I think if you have some information that you need the reader to have, because all the way through the book, I'm using Tom's perspective as a way of explaining things and slowly sharing out pieces of information, which at the end helps him to draw a conclusion and helps the reader to draw a conclusion. If I'm doing that, and it's one conversation, one piece of information, and after a while you begin to feel that rhythm. So in this conversation I have to tell you about my tragic upbringing. In this conversation I have to tell you about my first murder. In this conversation, it's boring, because after a while you kind of look for that little sparkly bit in the middle of it and go, okay, I've had my information, the rest of this I can just skip to the next bit. I don't want to do that. So what I try to do is put things together that maybe have an interesting contrast. So both of the characters in the book are parents. Just so happens. Both of them have been married, and when one character is saying something, it's often causing the other character to think about their relationship with their child, their relationship with their partner, or whatever. And it's a natural place to launch into another subject or to explore something more deeply, and that enables you to get conversations that feel as though they are naturally flowing from one subject to the next in a way that builds up the story and the information that the reader has without giving away too much too soon. At least that's the hope.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for that.
That's a long answer.
Yeah, but I think also necessary. It's ways of getting around in a sense of position.
Yeah, everything should theoretically serve a purpose. Although, if I say the sky is blue, it doesn't mean that I have a fixation with the colour blue.
And the sky is not.
No, but it is pleasant today.
Yeah.
This is the New River Gorge. This is a really pivotal place in the book. After a lot of driving, a lot of time on the road, Tom and Jay find themselves compelled to lay low for a day or two. And this is a place that has real significance to Jay. It brings back memories to him of childhood holidays with his family. And it's easy to see when you look around here what a fantastic place this would be to come when you're young. It also gives Tom and Jay a real opportunity to connect. They're no longer thinking so much about the murders and stuff like that. This is an opportunity for them to actually get to know each other as people. And it's also quite a calming place, so it has some almost like recuperative qualities for the characters. Being here now, it's an incredible spot. Truly, truly beautiful.
How did you choose this area?
I needed to find some place where they could be off the grid a little bit, and I spent some time looking at different locations. Actually, a big part of choosing this place was because of where the New River Gorge goes. It actually goes further up to this amazing bridge and stuff like that, but it also goes through a small town called Thurmond, which is a kind of a unique ghost town. It has a population of 5, I think, now, but it used to be this big boom town when coal mining and stuff was big around here. And now I know it's one of the most remote places that you can get a train to in the States. So I'd come across that through some research, and then I just kind of followed the river down and sort of found a place not far away from Beckley and Oak Hill, which is where one of the victims comes from, and it just seemed like a really natural place to be. And when I explored it a little bit on Google, I found that this was such a beautiful place. Where better to be?
How has the dynamic and relationship between Tom and Jay changed during this period in isolation, in a sense?
I think when Tom gets to spend some time here with Jay, he starts to see the person behind the killer. So up until this point, there's been lots of things where he's been surprised by choices, actions, things that have been said. But when he comes to this place, it's an opportunity for the two of them to kind of connect. And I think this is where he first starts to really get to know Jay as a person. And I think it's not the person he was expecting.
Okay. Something that I noticed in the evenings when they're sitting out on the porch and having a drink, I felt that Tom answered more questions than he asked. So I felt that we found out more about Tom by Jay being more inquisitive about trying to get to know Tom regarding stuff that you can't find on the internet. But I would have thought that Tom, being the reporter, would have asked more questions.
I think Jay is trying to overcome Tom's shock and horror at his situation, and to try and force Tom to start thinking about the kind of the realities of the person and to understand what's going on. And I think in a way he's doing that by almost challenging his journalistic abilities. And there's a little bit of, dare I say it, kind of quid pro quo between the two of them in terms of two people who are really and genuinely getting to know each other. And it's kind of natural when you're chatting to somebody that you don't know that well. You tell them stuff about you, and that naturally makes it more comfortable for them to tell you something about themselves. So there's a little bit of that going on, but yeah, I think this is an opportunity for the two of them to explore who they are as people.
Do you think it's easier for them to talk in this sort of surround as opposed to when they're driving in the car?
I think it's different. There's something about being on the road, and I don't think I'd really appreciated that fully until doing this trip. But there's something about being on the road where there's a very strong sense of purpose. We are going from here to there. What time is it? Is there traffic? There's lots and lots of kind of focus on getting to the end of something. When you're here, there's none of that. There is absolutely nothing other than just slowing down, thinking, being. And I think that kind of change of pace also changes the way that they talk together, and gives them an opportunity to connect in a way that you wouldn't in a car. Also, there's a lot more eye contact, a lot more chance to have slower conversations. It's really cool.
Tom had been told by Jay that they were going to rest up here for a week. But after a couple of days, Jay suddenly announces, we've got to leave now. And there's no explanation. Jay gives Tom no explanation. So I was just wondering, for the readers, why did you do that?
Jay has his own timeline. He's a planner. He's somebody who has given months of thought to everything that's going to be going on. And a big part of this is a kind of a regimented timeline where he has to be in certain places by certain days. However, something happens if you've read the book, you'll know what it is. Something happens as they're leaving Oak Hill, which completely changes the plans. And this is the first time we truly get to see Jay having to think on his feet. He's no longer in his comfort zone of everything's planned, everything's kind of scheduled out. Now he's having to be reactive rather than proactive, and that side of his personality is quite different. So I thought it would be kind of really interesting to do that, but when he's here, he expects to be here longer, but then he's having to adjust his own schedule because there are other victims further down the road, and he's got to be in certain places at certain times. So as he starts to schedule things out and adjust his plans, the things that they're doing will have to change. And that's one of the reasons why the scheduling does change a little bit in terms of how long they think they're here. We are here in Oak Hill, West Virginia. Jay brings Tom to Oak Hill to meet one of the victims, which is kind of a creepy thing. But the victim is actually a victim from some time ago, like a year ago or something. And they first of all go to the cemetery in town. I'm not going to go there because it's a bit disrespectful to go to a real cemetery. But after taking him to the cemetery where Candace is buried, he brings him here to actually show Tom where Candace lived. So they park up literally here. And Jay points out the house, the end house there with the garages below, and talks about how he was able to abduct her first thing in the morning because people are less cautious first thing in the morning. You're always more on your guard at night, but first thing in the morning you maybe don't expect bad things to happen. So obviously as Candace walked along there, Jay was waiting for her with a van, and was able to stun her, get her into the back of the van and drive her out of here. The murder really, well, even though it's not something that he's witnessing right now, the murder seems quite shocking to Tom, and he gets angry at Jay about how cruel it is and how brutal a murder it is, and he kind of feels a sense of outrage. And this is one of the first places where Jay is strongly encouraging Tom to really investigate the victims and to understand more about the victims. But Tom says, well, what chance do I have? You've already murdered her. There's no way that I can get to know her now. And Jay reminds Tom to look back on his normal journalistic approach. What would he do? Now, Tom's normal approach is to speak to family, speak to friends, to get to know the victims of crime through the people left behind. But how can he do that? Except Jay's thought ahead and has actually arranged for them to meet one of Candace's best friends so that he can get an opportunity to talk to her and find out what the victim was like. And that really freaks Tom out because it's kind of a creepy situation. He's going to meet one of the victim's friends with the killer. But there we go. That's the kind of things that happen on this trip.
So how have you found today?
It's been really good. It's been strange to see like, I don't know, it just didn't feel so real. So, going out to Oak Hill, but Oak Hill has changed a lot. Even just looking at stuff on Google Street View, because you know you can kind of sort of go back through previous footage and stuff.
How long ago did you start writing?
It's been a few years, and it's changed whilst I've been looking at it, and it's different again today. So, but yeah, I've really liked seeing it.
See, I know that when I went there, the building was still up. But now if you talk about on Facebook, you go, oh man, McDonald's has been torn down. I was like, what?
Oh yeah.
Previously wrote Eye Contact, Knife Edge and Cutout. Police Procedurals. The first two books were based on a serial killer, and obviously with the police procedural you've got a detective involved in there. My first question to you is, what sort of a mindset do you have when you're having to inhabit the character of a serial killer?
I think for the first book, certainly, I kind of tried to find the easiest path to realism. So I based the character on somebody I knew and imagined how that person would react in the situations that I was writing about. I kind of changed one thing. I'm a big fan of changing just one thing. And I changed one thing about the character's childhood. Something that I felt would set them on the path to becoming a murderer. And then I just imagined how the person I know would behave in those situations. So I found that a very useful way to get started, because it enabled me to think about the villain of the story not just as a villain but also as a person. And I think that's important because I don't believe people start out evil necessarily. I think people can become properly evil. But I also think that a lot of that is down to the circumstances and the choices that they make as they're going through life.
Okay, so everyone's got the potential to become a serial killer depending on what's shaped them in their formative years? Would that be fair to say?
I don't know if everybody has the potential, but I think a lot of people do. If I had grown up in a society where killing was the norm, I would probably kill. If I grew up in a society where violence was the norm, I would probably at least be capable of violence. The fact that I'm not a violent person, I guess, is down to a product of my upbringing, the world that I live in, so on. But I don't think everybody would be capable of it. I think some people would flinch away from it.
Okay, and what was it like writing the detective in tandem with the serial killer?
I think the hardest thing, because the detective is based on somebody else, I think the hardest thing was keeping the two characters completely separate. So the detective can't know too much, the killer can't know too much. They only see the world through their own personal prism, and as a writer, you have to be able to compartmentalize those characters off. Otherwise you end up with situations where people are maybe not reacting or anticipating what's going to happen next in the story, but it shapes them, and you kind of almost feel like the characters are slightly on rails. I much prefer stories where you get that feeling of unexpected inevitability. So things happen and you can't anticipate them happening because life is crazy and hectic and does all sorts of weird things that we aren't ready for. But when you look back on the events that happen in a story, I like to see those events having a kind of an inevitability. That had to happen because of this thing that happened previously. It's not happening because it makes a good story. It feels more real if it feels that it was all cause and effect driven.
Going back to the serial killer, I'm curious with you writing crime fiction. What's the fascination with you writing about crimes, and how do you devise the murders or come up with the variety of murders?
Well, I was never intending to write crime. That happened very much by accident, just because the creative writing class that I went to, we started off writing a story, we had to pick a genre, I ended up with crime, and it was a happy accident, I guess. I'd never really thought too much about it, so I kind of came to it quite new, quite fresh. And I think the fact that I started properly reading crime with a view to understanding what the conventions of the genre were, what made it work, it was a good education. So that's how I started in crime, but I've always been fascinated by all sorts of different story genres. In terms of how it is to think up murders, it really depends on the character. Some killings are very much caused by a set of circumstances, so heat of the moment things. It might be, the first object that comes to hand. It might be a chance meeting between two characters. All of these things can shape the way that a death happens. I've been quite fortunate though, because a couple of my characters have been very premeditated planners. So they have the opportunity to set up their kills, and I think from a story perspective that affords me the opportunity to be more creative. There are some killings that are just too gruesome for me, and I don't like the kind of horrible suffering torture porn sort of stuff that you get in some stories. It's just, not my thing. But I think being creative about the way that things happen, and also writing death scenes that people can imagine is quite important, because I do think that if I talk about somebody being disintegrated, nobody knows how it feels to be disintegrated, but we all know how it feels to be cut with a knife. We all understand how it feels to bang our heads, and I think we can all imagine how terrible it would be to be deprived of breath. So these are ways that I think I can create empathy with the characters in a scene. And I think if the reader can empathize with the characters in a scene, then that part of the story is all the more intense. So that's usually what I go for.
Okay, and you said with 2 of the characters planned. What about the unplanned?
He's an interesting one because he's motivated very much by not the voices in his head, but his own inadequacies and his own sense of injustice and rage. So he's a much more emotional killer.
Sorry, just to interrupt you on that. Which character and which book are you talking about now?
I'm talking about the villain from Cutout. I'm not going to name him because if you haven't read Cutout, I'd like it to be a little bit of a surprise as to who it is.
Okay.
But the character in Cutout who is the, I'm going to say villain, but there's actually 2 villains in that story. But the main one, he's not somebody who's thought things through. He's very insecure, and I think that's reflected in the way that he deals with people. Everything's passionate with him. Everything's emotional. Everything is him kind of building up, and then it's an explosion of rage and anger and frustration. So the way he kills is quite different. He would never spend days or weeks or months planning revenge on someone. And I think those kind of deaths, when you write them, there's an aspect where you want to try and bring the reader along with you, in terms of you want them to feel the rage or the injustice or the frustration. You want them to feel that pent-up energy in themselves, because I think it helps then for the reader to be able to understand why something terrible is happening. It's not just gratuitous violence on the page, it's that inevitability again of this had to happen because the character has reached the end of their tether in some way.
Up Close and Fatal, when did you start writing that? Was that pre-pandemic or during the pandemic?
That was pre-pandemic. In fact, the first draft of it was ready just as the pandemic was starting. But the story changed quite a bit. I did quite an extensive series of edits and rewrites on it, perhaps more than usual, to balance the characters out. So I've had the luxury this time of taking a while over getting it to feel right, and I've had some very, very helpful edits from some very competent people. So that's all been good. But yeah, it was written pre-pandemic, and I think it's more appropriate to have waited till now to bring it out, because we're kind of getting back to normal, and it feels like the sort of story, if you're going to do a road trip, then a road trip is something that really requires us to be able to move around.
Yeah. Now, how did you find writing in pre-pandemic to doing the rewrites during the pandemic, where you're virtually working from home all the time?
I found it really useful. It meant that even though I was cooped up all the time without really being able to go out anywhere, mentally I was on the road for a lot of the time, and that was great. And I think it involved a lot of imagination and vicariously traveling through internet research and stuff. But it's been very reassuring to see that as we come to all these locations, that it just feels exactly as I imagined it. And I think that's been one of the most rewarding things, is seeing New York, the neighborhood where Tom lives, seeing the kind of places in Delaware and Annapolis, and here in West Virginia, all of that just kind of coming together, and it really feels like this is a place I know, even though I've never been here before, and I love that. Okay, so I have a question for you. That question is, you're reading the book as we're traveling across America. How does it feel reading the story in the actual locations that the book is set?
That's a difficult one. I'm trying to get over the fact that you're asking me questions now, and I wasn't quite prepared for that, and I don't like being filmed, so hey ho. So reading the book, I've been trying to keep one step ahead so that I've got an idea of what's coming, and it gives me better insight into being able to discuss with you the whys and wherefores of certain places, your thought process, etc., and to have an understanding of the characters and their dynamics as they travel. It's really brought it to life, and it's made me look at each individual area with a different set of eyes. So I like to look at the area in terms of being a tourist, because this whole journey has been new to me. We've travelled to America, West Coast and Missouri, but never the East Coast and West Virginia. So you've got part of me that's looking at the different cultures that we've all, populous within New York, from the Bowery area to the Times Square, etc., as a tourist, but also looking at New York in terms of what would it have been like for, say, Tom living there, and especially near Times Square, and when we went to the the bus depot place, that it just felt like, oh gosh, this is real. And the book married up very well with the descriptions there, and so that there was that balance in me of when I was actually working in my head regarding wanting to understand the actual characters, it was almost like I'd created another part of myself to view it through their eyes, trying to inhabit Tom and what it was like to live where he lives in his apartment. And then there was me as the tourist looking at the area and the graffiti art and thinking, wow, this is just mesmerizing, it's beautiful, because that's the artist within me.
Was it creepy visiting places like Seaford and places like Oak Hill today, where bad things happened in the story?
Yeah, now yeah, and especially today when we had the conversation looking at where Candice lived and the explanation of that Jay, the serial killer in the book, is saying that people are off guard in the morning, and that has really resonated in me, thinking, well, what am I like when I first leave the house in the morning? Do I feel safer because it's broad daylight? And I don't actually think about, well, where are the blind spots ordinarily, but maybe I should.
But you're still prepared to drive out into the desert with me.
Yeah, well, I'm a good fighter, I'm a good scrapper. Yeah. Okay, question for you. I've encountered in the book Hannah, a third passenger now on this road trip. Had you pre-planned her joining the party with Tom and Jay, or did the idea take root as you've got further into the book, writing the book itself?
I always wanted, from the very beginning, to have an unexpected passenger joining. It sounds a little bit like seeing how the kind of the meal is made, but the reason to have somebody else joining the journey is to shake up the dynamic between the two characters, and to stop them getting too comfortable. It throws Jay off more, having this additional worry of another person, and it also gives Tom an opportunity to maybe not be so feeling sorry for himself, but to take on a more protector role. So it's that shifting dynamic between the characters, which is kind of upset by the addition of a new person.
I was surprised that Tom stepped in and saved Hannah. I thought maybe it would go down that he would just look to, go back to self-pity, you've killed someone else, and oh, how awful, blah, 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 blah. But is now in that quandary of sort of like semi-angry at times at Hannah, but he chose to save her, and because now he's responsible for her, it has changed the dynamic somewhat. What made you have Jay make Tom so responsible and leaving Tom and Hannah on their own at times?
I think there's several aspects there. One is Tom has been as you say, feeling a bit sorry for himself, being a bit passive, being a bit of a victim as as the journey's been going on. With Hannah, this is the first time that somebody has actually asked him for help, and this has kind of stirred something in him and made him stand up to Jay. And I think also he's starting to get a sense of how far he can go with Jay, how much he can push those limits, and he really wants to avoid another death. But I think Jay is at this point of the mindset, if you're suddenly deciding that you care about one person rather than somebody else, then fine, but it's your problem. You have to take responsibility, you have to own that decision. And having somebody else to worry about, and Hannah's presence certainly increases the risk for what Tom could lose. It also has a sort of a subtle, unexpected benefit of helping to keep Tom in line a little bit, because he's no longer thinking about what he can do to get out from his agreement with Jay, but he's thinking about how he can avoid Hannah inadvertently breaking things and putting his family at risk.
Has Tom regretted saving Hannah as the trip continues? Because obviously he has an agreement with Jay, or Jay has promised, whether he will uphold the promise we don't know, that they'll go their separate ways at the end of the journey. That obviously was not agreed at the beginning between parties pre-Hannah. What's Tom's thoughts as to, well, what happens at the end of the journey? What happens with Hannah?
It does raise that question, doesn't it? It makes everything a little bit less certain for Tom, and that makes him nervous. I don't think he resents Hannah for being caught up in all this, because he walked into it with his eyes wider open than she did. But I think he probably finds himself wishing that circumstances hadn't panned out the way they did, because it does put an additional layer of risk on him keeping his family safe, and it does make it less predictable. So he's gone from being the wild card to being somebody who's trying to control a different wild card.
I know you know the ending, I don't. But in just Tom's general makeup, if it came to it and Jay offered Tom the option of to save Hannah's life at the end, your family will be fine, would you die instead of her? Do you think Tom would take that or not?
I think Tom would die for his family, or for his son anyway. I think he's realised that already. But with Hannah, the reason he sort of stood up and put himself between Hannah and Jay, I think he's starting to realise that he has put himself in a terrible position, and he's done it deliberately for selfish reasons, and then he's been caught. I think as the journey goes on, Tom is starting to take more responsibility, and I don't know if he's at the point yet where he would definitely consciously sacrifice himself for Hannah, but he's already kind of put himself in front of her to stop Jay shooting her. So I think he's getting there, yeah.
Do you think Jay is enjoying watching Tom trying to control Hannah?
I think I think Jay doesn't like risk, but I do think Jay likes putting Tom in a situation where he has to behave more responsibly. He has to toughen up a little bit. So I think he enjoys it from that perspective at least.
Okay, so they come with 3 pancakes, hash brown,
This is so good.
Okay. Do you want to explain where we are?
We're at IHOP
I'm coming.
In which location?
in Austin, Texas.
And what are you eating?
Pancakes, French toast, sausage, bacon, egg.
And I've got protein pancakes, and they are wonderful. I don't know how he's going to manage to drive after eating all that, because that would just knock me out. But a superb place. Austin, people really super friendly, and if I had to move to somewhere in the States, it would definitely be Austin.
So, welcome to the desert. We're staying in the most luxurious glamping tent ever, right out in the desert. And we're just a short distance away from Alpine, Texas. And today we're going to be heading down towards Mexico to find some locations that occur towards the end of the book. But oh my gosh, the desert is beautiful. Catch you later.
I'm curious, when you were writing about this, the atmosphere in the car, you have Hannah, Tom and Jay in the front, and there's an elephant in the room, namely Caitlin, who's in the boot. Now, what are your thoughts of the different characters and what was going through their minds while driving along this very harsh environment, knowing that they've got someone who's alive in the boot. Explain.
Well, I made a conscious decision when I was writing it to have the characters, or certainly Tom, to be very uncomfortable about the idea that there was somebody bound in the trunk of the car. Not just because he had undergone a kind of a van journey in captivity himself, but also just the thought of somebody being stuck in a confined space, how terrifying that would be. But what I think I'm only just realizing now how intensely hot and uncomfortable it would be. We're sitting here with the air conditioning on, and even with the air conditioning on, it's kind of like very, 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 very toasty, and I keep having to move my hands out of the sun because it's hot. The idea of being stuck in the dark and being so hot and confined. So that's one of those things that I thought it would be bad, but now that I think about it more, I think it would be worse than bad. So yeah, not very nice.
What's Jay's thoughts at this point with the driving?
I think Jay has mixed feelings. I don't think he feels a particular amount of sympathy for Caitlin after all the pain that she's caused. For him, I also think he's discovered that the killing isn't enough. So he's really focused on the one small sliver of redemption that's left to him, which is being truly exonerated to the people that matter most to him, and people finding out the absolute truth, that he was not guilty of what he's been accused of. So I think he would be really uptight and very, very kind of conflicted at this point, because he must feel such hatred for the person who's done all this to him. But at the same time, there's that little bit of hope that there's some redemption ahead.
And what about Hannah? What was going through her head at this point in the journey?
Well, massive spoilers. So yeah, don't listen if you don't already know the ending. But for her at this point, she is also approaching a very, very significant moment, because the truth is just as important to her as it is to Jay. So
In what way for her? Did she believe that her dad was innocent, or was there a part of her that was wondering, well, why would all of this happen? Why would he have been arrested if there wasn't some sort of truth?
I think we always want to believe the people that we love, but there's a kind of a closure and a finality in hearing it as a fact from someone else, in kind of that moment of confession. So that aspect of it is important to her, and also wanting redemption for her father, and she knows that this is important to him as well.
Something that wasn't in the book, but I was just wondering, because of, it's normally in your head, even we don't like to have straight exposition, and there was no need for it in the book to come out. But I'm curious, the time before, between the death of his wife and the party. Had Hannah been living with her father? What was the relationship like after the wife's death and his exoneration from the police letting him go?
I think that's something that's not particularly explored in the book, I've left that deliberately blank because I think the whole family must have been in a terrible, terrible quandary. The fact that his wife left him is obviously suggesting that she at least had doubts, concerns, couldn't cope with the pressure, and I think the same must be true of the daughter. So yeah, it's a horrible situation for them.
But he had been set free.
He had been set free, but not from the persecution.
No. So, are you going to say what had brought them together, or how they got back together?
In terms of what brought them back together, I think Jay would be the person who would make the first move. His daughter has been through so much. I think Jay is driven at least partly by a concern that his daughter might learn the truth and then seek vengeance herself, and that's something that he's desperately wanting to avoid. Part of what he does in terms of punishing the people who have wronged him is he's undertaking that kind of vengeance trip so that his daughter doesn't, and I think that's the kind of his life is already trashed. There's nothing more bad that can happen to him other than losing his daughter, kind of thing. So he wants to preserve that relationship and be a good father, do stuff so that she doesn't have to.
Okay, explain where we are.
So we are in the desert. This whole area is just arid, way down south of Texas, not too far from the Mexican border, and it is insanely hot. As you can see around here, it's just desolate, miles and miles of emptiness, and really no shelter at all from the sun. So this is kind of, in many, it's not the end of the book per se, but it's in some ways the end of the journey, because this is the kind of landscape that Jay threatens to leave Caitlin alone in. He's going to leave her alone out here. Nobody would ever find you, even if you had some sense of where you were and how to get there. The heat is so oppressive, and at night this place becomes unbelievably cold. So I'm genuinely exhausted standing here talking to you about it, although that's probably my Scottish genetics. But the idea of being abandoned out here is completely horrific.
I think the other thing to remind the readers about is Caitlin was kidnapped from her bedroom. She was still in her pajamas. She does not have shoes. I'm wearing Dr. Martens and that's a blessing in this sort of terrain. But for someone who's barefoot and just in pajamas without any headwear or water.
Yeah, I've already trodden on several spiky twigs which went straight through my shoes. So yeah, it's a thoroughly inhospitable landscape. The sun is just everywhere. There is no escape from it. There's a tiny bit of wind that you can feel occasionally, but even that is just, I mean, if you kind of, it's only just enough to move this. So you can see how completely inhospitable and just burning this place is. But at the same time, it's kind of beautiful. Warm. You can just feel yourself cooking. My sunglasses are heating up and becoming uncomfortably warm on my face.
Oh gosh. So this location is the Rio, we're just approaching the Rio Grande, which is the river that divides the southernmost part of America to Mexico. So straight ahead is Mexico, and we're getting close to the river now. Now, in the book, final chapter, we're left wondering what happened with Jay and Hannah. Whether the whole thing with ending with the last victim in the desert, etc., was so that they could escape into Mexico. We'll never know.
Okay, so we've run out of America now. We've been from New York all the way down to the Rio Grande, and everything that you can see behind me is Mexico. So, it's not the end of our journey, but we can't go any further in this direction.
So how have you found at least 8 states in 10 days so far?
It's been amazing, a truly awesome journey, and I don't think I've ever enjoyed traveling as much as I've enjoyed this. It's just been so varied. We have seen so much, and it's been really extremes stuff, from going from the kind of the intensity of New York to the kind of the really rolling green hillsides of West Virginia, and then out here to the just vast open spaces in the desert. It's been the best journey. It's been amazing.
So do you feel changed in any way from this experience?
Yeah, I think everything that we do changes us, and it's been enjoyable for me, particularly thinking about the characters and the story and following in the footsteps of those characters has been interesting. But I think also it's changed me personally, because it's been an opportunity to see more of the world and to see some really awesome places. People have been very friendly. The food's been amazing. But it's just been really uplifting after the last couple of years where life has been kind of on hold a little bit. It's been really wonderful to get out and see such beauty. So I've enjoyed it more than, I can't think of anywhere I've ever been that's been more enjoyable. So this has been brilliant.
Okay, question for you. Obviously, we all have playlists for various things. Like for me, when I'm creating art, helping me clear my mind before doing something. I was curious in the book where so much of the time was spent on the road, and I was just wondering what sort of music would have been playing in the car to fill the empty silence.
They do put the radio on a couple of times, but that's mostly in West Virginia, so I'm guessing that would be a bit of country. The music I listened to a lot, because I like to use music as a way of finding a mood when I'm writing. The music that I listened to a lot this time around was a kind of a mix. There was the theme, sorry, I'm trying to remember it. The theme from True Detective Season 1, which is, I think, called Far From Any Road by the Handsome Family, which is just really chilling. Quite a few bits from Natural Born Killers as well, so some Leonard Cohen. And quite a lot of music by Hammock as well. I find there's something very mentally calming about the music from Hammock, and several of their albums have that big kind of space feel. So there was a lot of that, but I don't think that would have been what they would have listened to on the road. I think they would have probably listened to the radio, I guess, because they wouldn't want to stream any music, because that obviously leaves a digital footprint. So I think Jay's too smart for that, and I reckon he'd probably have just put on the radio when he didn't want to hear Tom talking.
So explain where we are and the significance of this place in the book.
So this is the Big Bend Regional Medical Center in Alpine, Texas. And this is where it all ends, I guess. This is the final significant location in the story. For those of you who've read it, this is where both endings happen, I guess. The desert is huge and vast and empty. And this is like a little outpost of civilization and care, and this is where they basically bring Caitlin at the end. So it seemed an appropriate place to bring our overall journey to an end right here, where both endings of the book are. And it's yeah, strange to have come all this way and finally found ourselves here. But the whole journey has absolutely made everything more real. So I'm very grateful to have been able to do this, and I hope you've enjoyed coming along with us. And it's got that. What does that mean?
Louder, not speed it up.
I think you're going to say skip to the end. If you get up and just walk off. That's not a good sign if you do that. I want to talk about a tough cry. Come back, I haven't answered yet. What was the question again?